May continue.
Thank you, Madam President. Ladies and gentlemen, so in addition to this 90-day requirement that we're in the process of repealing right now that hasn't been in our Constitution for over 54 years, there was also some talk about early voting and when that began. And while I was sitting here, I pulled an article from 2009 written by James Alcorn in the Richmond Public Interest Law Review, in which Mr. Alcorn notes the history of absentee voting in Virginia. And he said, first of all, it dates back to the Civil War, when the members of the Virginia or Confederate Armed Services absent from their homes because of the presence of the public enemy were permitted to vote absentee. So that's when it started in our state, was in the Civil War. Then it talks about how absentee voting became more widespread when we allowed soldiers during World War I to vote absentee. And then other states questioned the constitutionality of absentee voting, but it was upheld by the Supreme Court of Virginia in 1928. 1928, this has been going on. People have been, you know what? People have been voting before Election Day since 1928, since 1864. Can you believe that? This early voting, folks, is not a new thing. And stop telling the voters it's a new thing, and stop pretending like it's a new thing. It's not new at all. It's over, what, 160 years old now? Now, Madam President, I want to make sure the record's clear on that. Now, with regard to this underlying amendment, there's been a lot of talk today about how we shouldn't get all hot and bothered by what other states are doing or about what the Trump administration is doing to our state and to our country. I take offense at that. I didn't get elected to this body just to focus on the local curiosities of what happens in my little community. Remember, I represent the homes of George Washington and George Mason. George Mason wrote a document that ended up being the first Declaration of Rights that was ever adopted in the world, ended up being parroted all across the country. George Washington put his butt on the line. He put his neck on the line. He was one of the wealthiest people in America. He put everything on the line because of what was happening to what was then the colony of Virginia and then the people of America. And what they decided to do was take a stand against monarchical tyranny. They decided to take a stand against somebody who thought he was a king. Our state, you all should remember, I think everybody does remember, we're the birthplace of American democracy. Washington, Jefferson, Madison, Mason, they created a republic where people govern themselves through fair representation, something called democracy, representation. Meaning people who vote get to pick their elected officials, and their elected officials make the government. That's a founding principle of our country. When Patrick Henry said, "Give me liberty or give me death," in this Capitol, he meant the liberty of these people to choose their own government, a government that would make decisions for them, and not the liberty of political parties to rig elections through gerrymandering, to rig the outcome of a national election. That isn't what Patrick Henry stood for, right down the street at Churchill when he said that. When Jefferson wrote, "Governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed," he meant actual consent, not consent that's manufactured artificially by some computer programs that decide what a body's going to look like. And when Madison designed our systems of checks and balances, he understood no branch should be allowed unchecked power. Gerrymandering, folks, has broken that system. When Virginians adopted our redistricting system, this amendment, not independent commission, not bipartisan commission, not nonpartisan commission, but when we adopted it in good faith, Republican-controlled states have gone the opposite direction. California created a commission, New York created a commission. Republican states did not. And when Virginians voted for this, they did not envision what's happening in our country today. Nobody did, because nobody thought it was humanly possible. Nobody thought that the Republican Party would just hop in line and not even fight back against government tyranny. Nobody envisioned a tyrant who would ignore our Constitution, our law on a daily basis. No one I never thought I'd see the day when a Republican president enacts by fiat, according to the economist we heard from at ODU at the Senate Finance Committee meeting just 2 weeks ago, the largest tax increase as a percentage of GDP in the last 50 years without a vote of Congress. That's what the tariffs are, folks. Make no mistake. The largest tax increase in the last 50 years as a percentage of GDP. I haven't heard a peep, not a peep, out of a single Republican in this state. I've heard about it from Rand Paul. I've heard about it from a few other people that have the courage to speak out. And I've heard a bunch of rural Republicans that are upset they can't sell their soybeans, that Trump's trying to sell their cattle to Argentina right now. But I haven't heard a single thing out of people who purport to represent the rural people of this state while tariffs ruin the economy. The largest tax increase. So much for the party of Reagan. But a tax increase like that is taxation without representation. I never thought I would see United States Congress completely abdicate their responsibility to conduct any kind of government oversight to the president. It's gotten so bad that President Trump even called himself the speaker last week. I never thought I'd see a United States Supreme Court who's completely abdicated its responsibility to enforce our Constitution and limit the power of the different bodies. A Supreme Court has thrown out norms, centuries and centuries of norms established by Virginians like John Marshall, called stare decisis. Virginia voters did not envision the federal power grab that we see today. They didn't imagine Texas, Missouri, Indiana, and by the way, a couple hours ago, Ohio, engaging in the most extreme partisan gerrymandering in American history. This is a coordinated national strategy to grab power. And the fundamental problem here, the fundamental problem that we are giving ourselves the option to address, is that Virginia cannot fight with one hand tied behind its back. We joined this country as part of the Constitution back in 1883 by making a deal with the other states that we would all treat each other a certain way. We'd all be fair to each other. We embraced fair redistricting because we believe in good government. But when we did this, the Republicans doubled down on gerrymandering. The result, Democrats might be able to win more votes nationwide, but still be locked out of Congress for a decade, even though winning election after election after election after election nationwide by more votes. That's not democracy. It's not what we signed up for, and it's not sustainable. We have an election coming up in 2026. Those 2026 midterms are going to be a referendum on our nation's direction. But you know what? If gerrymandering has already decided the outcome, the people's voice is going to be silenced. That's not democracy. The constitutional remedy for an administration that goes off its track is congressional oversight, but that remedy is meaningless if gerrymandering makes it mathematically impossible for the opposition to actually win an election. We're not arguing that Democrats deserve to control Congress, but we are arguing that voters should decide who controls Congress. Gerrymandering is preventing that. Now, I want to make clear, our founders were not they were not naive idealists. They understood power. Washington didn't defeat the British by refusing to fight. Jefferson didn't expand democracy by deferring to his opponents. Madison didn't protect our Constitution by allowing enemies to subvert it. John Marshall didn't empower the Supreme Court by sticking his head in the sand. Patrick Henry, he also didn't say, the King of England, that's some guy across the ocean. He's not here in Virginia. We don't need to worry about it. Some of the arguments I've heard today. You didn't hear Virginians saying, well, the Tea Party is just some little Massachusetts thing, not part of the fight here in Virginia. Maybe there were some that said it. They ended up leaving the state after the Revolution. We face a hard choice today, maintaining our commitment to fair redistricting while watching Republicans gerrymander their way into permanent power. Or we need to acknowledge that when only one side plays by the rules become unilateral disarmament. Now, some people might call this a power grab. I've heard that called a couple times today. That's not what it is. This is about whether our democratic system will function as intended, whether our voters will have a meaningful choice, whether Congress can check executive power, whether gerrymandering has rendered that function impossible. I would prefer a federal law banning partisan gerrymandering nationwide. I would support that constitutional amendment in a heartbeat. The U.S. Supreme Court had a chance to do it when they could have adopted the vote waste theory in the Wisconsin case that was there a few years ago. They chose to punt. Look what's happened. But absent those solutions, we can't allow certain partisan tyrannical majority to continue to gerrymander itself into permanent power while we sit around and cite our commitment to principle. Virginia's role as the birthplace of democracy gives us a special responsibility not to stand by idly while democracy is dismantled, but it's our job as the leading colony in the state that created our country to defend it with every tool at our disposal. That is what we are called to do. And that's why this body was created, by the way, if you go back and look at the history books. The Senate didn't even exist until 1776. So we're not asking for immediate action. We're just asking for a serious conversation about whether our current approach is sustainable to American democracy. We need to study the impact in other states of gerrymandering. We need to study different scenarios. We need to engage the public. We should have a debate. I welcome the debate. Let's have a debate over the next 3 months. Let's have a debate over the next 6 months. Let's have it. I'm sure we're going to hear it again in January. We need to make sure that Virginia is not permanently disadvantaged in the fight for congressional control. Madam President, what do you do when one side refuses to play by the rules? Do you maintain your principles and accept defeat, or do you recognize that preserving democracy sometimes requiring tools you find distasteful to prevent permanent entrenchment of minority rule? We owe it to our constituents to have this conversation. We owe it to democracy to consider all the options. We owe it to our future generations to ensure that people, not the map makers, pick their representatives and decide who's in control of the federal government. The 2026 elections are coming. The American people are going to go to the polls expecting the votes to actually count. But if gerrymandering has already decided their outcome in Texas, Missouri, Florida, Ohio, Indiana, North Carolina, those votes are going to be meaningless. Our Virginia votes are going to be meaningless. So we honor Virginia's founders today by not clinging to principle while losing power, but by understanding, as they did, that the preservation of democratic government sometimes requires us to match the tactics of those who would destroy it. This amendment, if we choose to present it to the voters next spring, will give Virginians the ability to return to the front of protecting American democracy, and I'm proud to support it. I would hope we'd vote yes.